I'd like to welcome everybody to the past class on how to effectively debrief a CP case. As you're all very much aware, learning how to write CP cases effectively is absolutely critical for passing the CP, given that the whole exam is case-based. So you really need to get good at writing cases. Now, there's no question that practice case writing is the only way to get good at case writing. You've got to write many cases, and as we all know, practice makes perfect. But just practicing cases and doing one case over and over again without a proper debriefing, unfortunately, will not necessarily lead you to learning how to write cases effectively. The way to get good at writing cases is to practice cases. In other words, practice writing the cases, but equally important, learn how to debrief the cases effectively. And that way you can improve from case to case. That way you're not just making the same mistakes over and over again and plateauing. The key is to continually improve through practice case writing. And for that to happen, you need to learn how to debrief a case effectively. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go through with you what I think are 6 very important steps that you need to follow as part of your own personal debriefing in order to improve your case writing. These steps that I'm about to go through are very relevant to any student who writes a practice case, gets back their marked case, and now they're ready to debrief it. These steps are also useful if you write cases and mark them yourselves. The key is you would be going through these 6 steps after your case has been written and marked. So the steps we're going to go through are as follows. The first step is to review the solution. The next step is to review the guide. The third step is to consider your time budgeting. Step number 4 is to examine AOs where you did not get competent. Step number 5 is to review your quants. And step number 6 are to keep good tracking notes. What I would like to do now is go through each of these steps in detail. Let's get started with the first step, reviewing the solution. Keep in mind that nobody, even the gold medalist, can do the perfect solution. It is humanly impossible to do the perfect solution within the very severe time constraints. So that's not your aim. That's an impossibility. So my concern isn't, oh, did I do a replica of the perfect solution? That's certainly not going to happen. But what I am very concerned about is to make sure that I didn't miss a complete required. If you missed the complete required, that means you lost at least one AO. And in some instances, there could even be more than one AO associated with the required. So you could even lose a couple of AOs. You can't afford to be losing AOs because if you go back to the passing profile, and there's a separate video on that, so I'm not going to get into that today. But if you go back to the passing profile, very hard to pass if you're continually losing complete AOs. So it's absolutely imperative to ensure that there weren't any requireds that were missed completely. Let's say you did miss a complete required, and that's quite likely to happen, particularly during the early stages of case writing. Rather than just saying, oh, I missed a required, hopefully I'll do better next time, you want to take it to the next step, and you want to ask yourself, why did I miss the required? Was it a reading problem? Perhaps I was reading too quickly, and as a consequence of reading too quickly, I completely missed that required. Perhaps there were 2 parts to a required, and because I read quickly, I missed one part of the required. This could be an issue on a day 2 case or on a day 3 case. In the case of a day 2 case, I always emphasize to my students that if there's one part of the case that you should read extra slowly, it's the role requirements. The extra 5 or 10 minutes you spend on those role requirements can mean the difference between missing a required or not missing a required. It can mean the difference between missing a part of a required or not missing a part of a required. Could mean the difference between correctly interpreting a required versus misinterpreting a required. So it could be you're just reading too quickly for a day 2 case or a day 3 case. It could also be a question in the case of day 3 where most of the requireds were in the main body of the case, and there was another required in an appendix, and you weren't paying attention to the fact that there could be additional requireds in the appendices, and therefore, although you picked up all the requireds in the main body, you missed the required in the appendix. So if it's a reading problem, if you've diagnosed it as a reading problem, then you need to make a mental note. In the future, maybe I'll read a little bit more slowly. Maybe I'll read a little more carefully. But you do need to understand what the problem was in order to improve, right? You got to first diagnose the problem, and then you know what to look out for the next time you write a case. Another possibility is it's a time allocation problem. One of the things that we emphasize tremendously at PASS is time budgeting. Given that these cases are terribly time constrained, both day 2 and day 3, particularly day 3, in my opinion, the bottom line is if you don't do a good job on your time allocation, you don't come up with an appropriate budget, and more importantly, stick to that budget, then what invariably is going to occur is you'll run out of time before you've addressed all the requirements. So you want to ask yourself, am I really sticking to my budget? Firstly, did I come up with a reasonable budget? And assuming I did I stick to it? Or did I go way over on the first few requirements I addressed, and therefore by the time I got to the end, didn't have time to address that last required? Big mistake. I would much rather not address each required perfectly, because I don't need perfection anyhow, and have enough time to get to all the requireds, than try to do each required perfectly and then run out of time and miss the last 1 or 2 requireds. You just can't afford that. And then a final possibility is that it was a technical issue. Sometimes people don't address the required because they just have no idea what to write. You know, a particular issue came up. I don't know, let's say asset retirement obligation came up as an accounting issue, and you didn't address it because you just didn't know anything about the topic. If it's a technical issue, it's very important to know that, because that means that it's not really a case writing problem here. It's I don't know my technical for that particular topic. So there, what I would do is I would go back and I would study that technical as part of my debriefing. One of the things that I always tell my students is that when I was preparing for my own exam, one of the reasons why my technical was really strong by the time I got to my exam in September, I wrote in my days, the exam was only offered in September, not in May. When I got to September, the reason why my technical knowledge was very good is I made it a practice, and I did this religiously, so to speak. Anytime a technical issue came up and I wasn't able to address the required, or I could hardly address the required because I didn't know the technical, part of my debriefing was to go back and study that technical. So I was continually filling in my technical gaps. If you do that, by the time you get to the CFE, your technical will be very strong. And the nice thing about filling in your technical gaps as part of your debriefing is in one fell swoop, you learn your technical, but you also see it applied. That's really great, because when you've just studied technical in isolation, you don't immediately see the application. Let's move on now to step number 2. Step number 2 is an extremely important step, and it entails reviewing the guide very carefully. What am I focusing on when I look at the guide? When I look at the guide, what my major focus is, what was it? What did I miss? What did I not do that prevented me from getting competent? That's the key thing I'm interested in. Why did I get RC rather than competent? What was missing? What was missing in my response that prevented me from going from RC to C? If I got competent, I'm a happy camper. I could care less what prevented me from getting CD. I don't even want to necessarily get CD, because I know that in order to get CD, I'll probably have to waste too much time on that required, and I'm going to end up losing out on another required. So if I didn't get CD, I'm perfectly happy. Getting CD doesn't bring me any closer to passing, and it might just waste a lot of time. But if I got RC rather than C, then I want to know what was it that prevented me from getting to that next level. What prevented me from going from RC to C? So I think the best way to explain this is by taking a look at a real CFE guide, and on that basis, I can explain exactly the approach. So let's take a look at this example. This is a capstone guide from a real CFE. Let's use this as an example to demonstrate this step. Let's take a look at this guide. What did you really need to do in order to be competent? In order to understand what you needed to do in order to be competent, let's take a close look at this guide. If you take a look at this particular guide, you can see that there were really 4 parts to it. This is a situation where you needed to deal with break-even. The first part of the guide, as you can see, is dealing with the calculation components. Basically, the calculation you needed to do in order to come up with a break-even. Notice that at the bottom of point 1, it tells you what you needed to do to get a yes versus what they call a partial. Partial will generally be good enough for getting reaching competence, but not good enough for getting competent. It's yeses that you typically need to get competent. So it says over here, partial if 5 attempted. If I did a poor job on the number crunching, but I hit 5 points, I might get 5 at the attempt level. Or 3 reasonably calculated. If you look at what reasonably calculated means, it means minor errors acceptable, calculations are well supported with assumptions. So one way to get partial is to do a poor job but hit 5 points. Another is to do a good job, your calculations are well supported with assumptions where appropriate, but yet you only hit 3 points. To get a yes, which will be necessary for competent, you need to get 5 of these items at the R level, at the reasonably calculate level. Now, if you take a look at point number 2, considers additional cost or accuracy of cost provided. We'll see later on how important that was for getting competent. Point number 3 was more for the qualitative analysis. Once again, if you look at point number 3, they tell you how many points you needed to hit and at what level you needed to hit them in order to get partial versus yes. Partial if 4 attempted or 2 discussed, yes if 4 discussed. Now, when you're dealing with qualitative issues, generally speaking, you're going to see attempt versus discuss. What does discuss mean? Discuss means that you did a good job effectively on the qualitative, meaning you incorporated case facts, you considered the impact to the company, LCC was a company, you considered the impact on, in this particular case, on the owner, and typically at the discuss level, they expect a discussion that's technically correct. So once again, they're saying either you hit 4 points, but you dealt with them quite poorly, or you hit 2 points, but basically you dealt with them well at the discuss level. So to get partial, either quantity or quality, but they're not looking for both. To get yes, which is going to be necessary for competent, you need both quality and quantity. You hit 4 points and you had a quality discussion. And then finally, if you look at point number 4, provides a conclusion on whether or not LCC should pursue the boat rentals consistent with a quantitative and qualitative analysis. Note that point number 4 is focusing on the need to conclude, bearing in mind both your quants and your qualitative. Now I'd like to take a look at what you needed to do to get competent versus reaching competence. Because again, I really want to move from reaching competence to competent if at all possible. So if I got reaching competence, I need to understand what I need to do to move up that level to competence. If you look at competent, it says the candidate calculates the contribution margin and required break-even volume and provides a qualitative discussion. Now, what does that mean? So yes on calculation components, meaning 5 reasonably calculated numbers among the calculation component. I did a decent job and I hit 5 points in point number 1. Yes on qualitative analysis. I did a high quality discussion on 4 points in number 3. And then finally, yes on conclusion. I hit point number 4. Now, what are some of the reasons why I might have ended up with reaching competence? Reaching competence says partial on calculation components or yes on qualitative analysis. Why might I be reaching competence rather than competent? So let's take a look. It could be that for point number 1, you basically didn't get a yes. And the reason you didn't get a yes was, A, you just didn't know break-even well enough. So you better go back and review your break-even analysis. Go back to whatever technical sources you were using and make sure to fill in that technical gap. Another possibility is that you knew break-even absolutely inside out. But the problem was, once again, time constraints. It could very, very well be that you spent too much time elsewhere and that therefore didn't have enough time to hit enough points. There I know I better work on my time allocation. There can be various reasons why you're not getting a yes on point number one, but again, the most common reasons would be technical or time constraints. Now, what about for the qualitative? What if I didn't get a yes on the qualitative? Well, there are various reasons for this. I'll tell you one very common one. You allocated the right amount of time to this particular required, but you used up all of your time on the quants. Maybe you made the mistake of doing the quants as perfectly as you could, so you got well over 5 items in point number one at the reasonably calculate level, much more than you really needed, but you had no time left for the qualitative. Remember, there's got to be that right balance between quants and qualitative. On the number crunching, you're never trying to achieve perfection, right? You got to remember that. You're trying to do an adequate job on the numbers. There is a past course called Numerical Methods where we literally devote a number of hours to talking about how do I aim for adequacy rather than perfection. Because if you try to aim for perfection on the numbers, good chance that you're going to waste far too much time and you're going to sacrifice either other requireds or the qualitative relating to that particular required. In this case, the qualitative relating to the break-even. Another possibility is that you just were not able to use the case facts effectively. Notice, guys, that to get a yes, a qualitative discussion means tying back to case facts. So maybe you were far too generic. If you were too generic, then pay attention to that, because you know then that you better work next time on doing a better job of tying back to case facts. If a professional marker marked your case, say you wrote it in Capstone 2 or you wrote it in a course, the marker may tell you that you're not hitting the discuss level because you're not tying back to case facts. Take that to heart. Make sure that you do a better job on the next case, tracking case facts and tying back to them. Sometimes the qualitative to a large degree is common sense, and people are just afraid to use common sense. Don't be afraid to use common sense. It gets you a very long way on the CP. Finally, one reason why somebody might not have achieved competent is they forgot to conclude. One of the things that really pains me is when I see a candidate who actually got a yes on number one, actually got a yes on number three, and the only thing that prevented them from getting competent was they forgot to conclude, or they concluded tying back to only their quants or only their qualitative. That's enough to push you down to reaching competence, which is a real pity because you did a lot more than what you see here. You didn't get a partial on the calculation components, you got a yes. You also got a yes on the qualitative, yet you can't get competent because you're missing a conclusion. And that's a great pity, because at the end of the day, there isn't going to be a right or wrong conclusion in many, many instances. All that will matter is that you concluded consistent with your own analysis and you tied back to quantitative and qualitative. So if you miss getting competent because you don't have a yes for your conclusion, you better tell yourself next time around, I'm not going to forget to conclude. If you didn't get a yes because you didn't tie back to quants and qualitative, you'll make sure to do so the next time. Let's take a look now at step 3. Step 3 is an extremely important step where you consider your time budgeting. Time budgeting on the CP is absolutely essential. Given how time constrained this exam is, coming up with an appropriate time budget so that you allocate your time in an optimal manner, that's definitely a critical success factor for passing this exam. So what I'd like to now focus on is step 3, which deals with time budgeting. Let's say you spent less time than was budgeted on a particular required. You want to ask yourself why. And I'm assuming you did not do well on that required. If you spent less time and managed to do well, there's nothing to talk about. But say you spent less time than budgeted and consequently ended up getting RC or worse. So you want to understand why that happened, because just as it's important not to spend too much time on a particular required, spending too little time is also a problem, because if you spend too little time, that might preclude getting competent. So I want to ask myself, why did I spend less time than budgeted? So one possibility, and this is a really simple answer, is you ran out of things to say. Maybe a particular technical issue came up in tax and you just hadn't studied that area of tax. Residency came up and you just didn't remember the rules for residency, so you spent very little time on it because you had nothing to say. Well, if that's the problem, then as we talked about earlier in this video, you go back and you study that technical area, and that's how you solve the problem. It won't happen next time that technical issue comes up. Perhaps you were just nervous to get to the next issue, so you kind of jumped the gun and moved to the next issue before you even finished with your budget. You budgeted 15 minutes and you were so nervous after 10 minutes, you moved on to the next issue. So that's just more of a psychological thing where you just have to work on yourself and just force yourself to be disciplined and stay within the budget, not go below or over the budget. Obviously, going below is fine if you can finish quicker, but if you can't finish quicker, you don't just move on to the next required before you've finished your budget, so to speak, simply out of nervousness. So that's something where you just have to work on yourself. Another possibility is typing. Let's take a look now at step number 3. Step number 3 is where you consider your time budgeting. Time budgeting in this exam is absolutely essential. And the reason why it's absolutely essential is it's an extremely time-constrained exam. So allocating your time optimally between the various requirements, absolutely a critical success factor for passing this exam. So part of my debriefing is going to now focus on my time budgeting / time allocation. Presumably, I set up a budget for each of the required. Let's say I budgeted 15 minutes for required X, and I ended up spending less time than budgeted. So I'd want to ask myself why. Perhaps I ran out of things to say because a technical issue came up and I just didn't know enough about that technical issue. A particular tax issue came up, and let's say, for example, residency, and I hadn't studied that, and therefore I had nothing to say. So as a result of that, I spent much less time. There's only so much you can say when you haven't studied a topic properly. If that was the reason why you were below budget, then we go back to what we talked about earlier. You now have identified a technical weakness. You go back, you study that topic. So next time that topic comes up, you will have what to say, and you're not going to end up spending less time than your budget because you'll have enough in your brain and your mind to put down on paper. Another possibility, and this is more psychological, this is to a large degree a psychological test. It's not just a technical exam or, an exam that tests your aptitude in case writing. Of course, it is that too, but it's also a psychological exam. And psychologically, some people will sometimes get nervous. They've budgeted 15 minutes, they're only partway through after 10 minutes, and they somehow or other get nervous and say, I got to move on to the next required. And they just move on, although they still have more time. And by spending a few more minutes and filling out their budget, perhaps that would have gotten them from RC to C. So here you've got to stay calm. I know it's easier said than done, but try to remain calm. The calmer you remain, the more likely you are to not make this mistake of getting nervous and moving on to the next required prematurely. Another possibility, which is a good possibility, is your typing was faster than most people. So it made sense to allocate 50 minutes to that required. You were such a quick typist, you got through it a little more quickly. That's fine. That obviously is not a problem. And then finally, the other possibility is that you did spend the appropriate amount of time. The reason you did it under budget was your budget was just too large. You thought you needed 15 minutes for that required. And then once you started working on it, you realized it could be done more quickly. So once again, in that situation, there is no problem. Now, the much more common situation is that for one or more required, often more than one required, you spent more time than budgeted. And as a result, you didn't have enough time when you got to the final requirements. So if you spend more time than budgeted, once again, you must ask yourself, why did this occur? So one very, very common reason why this may occur is that you literally told the marker everything you knew about a particular subject. A particular accounting topic came up, discontinued operations, and you were supposed to deal with a specific issue in that case, dealing with discontinued operations. Or an issue came up around inventory, and the issue was whether the inventory is impaired, and you told the marker everything you know about inventory. Obviously, you've wasted time and that caused you to go over budget. Try to stick to the issue within that topic that's relevant. If inventory comes up, they don't want you to tell the marker everything you know about inventory. They want you to focus on the issue at hand. If the issue at hand was the potential write-down of inventory, the fact that the inventory may be impaired, then stick to that. Don't start dealing with other aspects that aren't relevant. So if you did that, make a very, very strong mental note. I'm not going to let this happen again. Next time, I'm going to make sure to stick to the subtopic that was relevant. Another possibility is the way you wrote. Some people are far too verbose. So ask yourself, could I have gotten across this same point in less words? One way that can sometimes be done is by using point form. I'm a pretty strong believer in point form. I find it's a very efficient way to get your thoughts down, in as few words as possible. But even if you're not good at using point form, and not everybody has to use point form, was I as concise as I could have been? Very often people go over budget because they say in 100 words what I literally would have said in 30 words, and I would have got exactly the same point across. So ask yourself, are you being too verbose? If you are, how can I be more concise? One way, and not the only way, is to use point form. Even if you choose not to use point form, you can still be more concise by simply getting the point across more efficiently. The other possibility is you went off track. And that's, similar to the first point. You went off track and you said things that just weren't relevant. Another possibility is you repeated yourself. Sometimes students will say something in 20 words, and then they'll say exactly the same thing again using different words. So now they've added another 20 words. Nobody's going to penalize you for repeating yourself, but you've now wasted time. By writing the same thing again in just using different words, the marker doesn't care, but the marker can only reward you once. So you've wasted your time. Time is so precious on this exam. So look for opportunities for where you may have repeated yourself. I shouldn't say opportunities. Look for situations where you repeated yourself, and then make a mental note, in the future, I'm going to avoid this. One of the reasons why people repeat themselves, in my opinion, is psychological. They lack the confidence that they got their point across clearly the first time. So they say exactly the same point again a second time in different words. But as a marker, most of the time, I got your point the first time around. So repeating that same point again in different words bought you absolutely nothing, and unfortunately ended up wasting time. So try to avoid repetition. I know when I wrote my exam, I had a mentor, and at the time I thought he was really obnoxious, but in retrospect, he was wonderful. What he would do is he would put in bright yellow marker all the places where I repeated myself. And my goal was to get rid of that bright, annoying yellow highlighting, because the more yellow highlighting on my paper, the more I had repeated myself. Anytime I repeated myself, he highlighted it. So that I found very helpful. But you can do the same thing yourselves. Ask yourself, did you repeat yourself? Finally, or I should say, one of the next points is, did I aim for perfection? One of the things we emphasize in the past course is you're not trying to do each required perfectly. You're trying to do it adequately. If you aim for perfection, you will go way over time and not have enough time for the other required, and it'll buy you nothing because you don't need to be anywhere near perfect. I'm sure depending on when you're watching this video, you've probably seen CP guides or simulated CP guides. And you know that, let's say I'm dealing with a particular qualitative issue where I have to deal with pros and cons. I don't have to get every single pro and every single con that's in the perfect solution. I need to get a subset of the pros and cons. So if I try to hit every last pro and every last con, wonderful, I'm now almost perfect. But what did it buy me? If I only needed to get 4 pros and 4 cons out of 7 or 8, and I got 6 out of 7 or 7 out of 7, it really didn't buy me anything. I realize you're not going to know the exact number you need to get, but the one thing you do know is you don't need to get every last pro and every last con. So you're much better off just trying to do it adequately and then moving on to the next required than trying to do it perfectly, where you will go over time. There's no question. Typing too slow, that could be a reason why you went over budget. If that's the issue, maybe you want to work on your typing. Maybe you can do, there's all sorts of quick online courses you can do. If you're simply not good in typing and you can't get better at it, and there are people like that. I, for example, might fall into that category. I don't know if I'll ever be a quick typist. So you know what I would be doing if I was writing? I would just have to learn to be more concise than others because I just can't get down as many words as other people within the time constraints. So I just learned to be more concise. Finally, one reason you might have gone over budget is that your budget was simply too small. If your budget was simply too small, then the problem is not the way you wrote the case, but the problem is that you didn't do a good budget. You did a budget that was too small. So now you want to go back and you want to ask yourself, am I doing, am I paying attention to how I should be budgeting? Normally, when you budget, you should be taking into account, number one, the amount of case facts available. If there's lots and lots of case facts available, you spend more time on that required. If there's a major quant involved, you spend more time on that required. So if it's really important to the client, you might spend a bit more time. So at the end of the day, you might want to go back and ask yourself, what did I miss here that prevented me from realizing this is required that takes more time? Perhaps I didn't realize that there was a major quant here that takes quite a bit of time. Perhaps I didn't realize there were so many case facts that I needed to consider. And again, by thinking about these things, hopefully you can improve your ability to budget and in future cases, come up with a better budget. Step 4 is examining the AOs where you got something less than competent. And you want to ask yourself the following questions. Did I write too little? I mean, again, by this, it's just as you don't want to write too much and go overboard, obviously you don't want to write too little either, right? If you write too little, you just won't get down enough content to hit enough points in the guide to get competent. Did I miss some key hints or words I should have picked up on? Sometimes there can be a key trigger in a particular required. And if you miss that trigger, you're not going to hit key points necessary for getting competent. So you want to be very sensitive to picking up triggers. So ask yourself, is there a trigger here that I should have hit that I missed? Here is where it helps to work with other people. I always used to like to, I always find that for most people, it's really, really beneficial to work with study partners. So if you have a study partner or a group of study partners who wrote the same case, you can always ask them, was there a trigger that I missed? And they might be able to point it out to you. Obviously, it's best to try to figure it out yourself. But if you can't figure that out yourself, where's the trigger I missed? Ask other people who wrote the case. They might be able to point you in the right direction. Was my technical up to speed? Notice we keep coming back to technical. If my technical wasn't up to speed, then obviously I wasn't able to get competent, because getting competent is a function of knowing your technical and being able to apply it effectively. So the starting point is to know your technical. If you don't know your technical, it's impossible to apply it appropriately, right? You've got to know your technical in order to apply it appropriately. Did I dump technical and not tie to the case facts? So at the end of the day, if you really think about the third and the fourth bullet, they're actually very, very different. The third bullet is a particular technical issue came up, and I just didn't know how to deal with it because I didn't have the technical knowledge. That's point number 3. Point number 4 is I had the technical knowledge. I knew it inside out. Problem is, all I did was dump out the technical knowledge without tying it back to case facts. I knew how to treat discontinued operations inside out. So I just recited the rules for discontinued operations. But that buys me nothing. What buys me something is my ability to take that knowledge and apply it to the case facts. Perhaps that was my weakness. If that was my weakness, then I know that's something I need to work on. Was it a ranking problem? Bottom line is, it could be that I came up with a really bad budget and I just allocated too little time to this required. And as a consequence, I just didn't have enough time to get competent. There, I got to go back and rethink the way in which I'm doing my ranking. Another thing you may want to ask yourself is, did I use the relevant past technique for moving from RC to C? In past, we talk about, for example, in the context of financial accounting, how do I get sufficient depth to ensure I get competent rather than RC? And we provide specific techniques. I'd ask myself, did I really use that past technique because perhaps if I didn't, that may explain, assuming I had the technical knowledge, that might explain why I didn't get competent. Same thing might be true for assurance. In assurance, IRA provides various techniques for achieving competent in different areas of assurance, different aspects of assurance. I might ask myself, did I actually do what I needed to do as part of that technique in order to achieve competent? Did I remember to ask myself why or so what for my qualitative analysis? One thing that we've been emphasizing at PASS, as long as PASS has been around, is that in order to get competent, you obviously need to be at the discuss level. And in order to be at the discuss level, one of the very, very important variables that distinguishes between the attempt level, which is good enough for RC, versus the discuss level, which is necessary for competent, is at the discuss level, you don't just state a fact, you explain why it's relevant. You give the implication. You give what we call the so what point. Like, why is this relevant? Why does this matter? It's very, very often the why that makes the difference between RC and competent. Very often, RC candidates say a lot of things that are correct, and they'll invoke facts that are relevant, but they won't explain why they're relevant, why they matter. Ask yourself, did I hit that why point? Did I hit that so what point? Did I remember to conclude? One of the things you'll see when you look at these guides is that concluding is very frequently absolutely essential for getting competent. You could do a brilliant analysis of an accounting issue, but if you didn't conclude, unfortunately, you're not going to get competent. At the end of the day, sometimes there isn't even a right or wrong conclusion. But if you don't conclude at all, you're not going to get competent. I'm discussing two possible audit type reports that could be given. And I do a great analysis with the pros and cons of each report. There might not even be a right report to choose, but I need to come to a conclusion. Choose report A or report B. If I fail to come to a conclusion, then I'm not going to get competent. I'm trying to determine whether my client should purchase another company. And I do a great analysis qualitatively and quantitatively, but then I forget to conclude, should they buy the company or not? Probably no right or wrong answer here, but not concluding at all is enough to prevent you from getting competent. So missing a conclusion is a real pity because it means you could have done an excellent job and the conclusion doesn't take very much time at all and very often isn't a right or wrong type of thing. So it's almost a waste, so to speak, to fail to get competent simply because you didn't conclude when it would have taken you a moment to conclude, and in many instances, any conclusion would have been fine. So be very sensitive to that. Always make sure that you didn't miss the conclusion point because that's something you can easily correct. Did I miss an opportunity for integration? Sometimes the requires can be integrated and required the outcome of A impacts B or the outcome of B impacts A. And recognizing that can be very, very important because I might need to take into account the outcome of one required in dealing with the second required. And if I miss that integration point, it might make it very difficult to get competent on that second required. The next step is step number 5. Here you're reviewing your quants. Obviously, this is only relevant when you're dealing with a quantitative AO. And you're asking yourself, firstly, did I score competent in this quant? If you got competent, there's really nothing more to do. You're a happy camper, and there's really, you may as well move on to looking at the next AO. If I didn't get competent, I really need to understand why. Did I do the right schedule they were looking for? On some CFE cases, they are very explicit about what schedule you need to do. They will tell you explicitly you need to do a break even. So in that type of situation, unlikely you did the wrong schedule. But in other situations, you need to decide what schedule to bring to the table. You're helping the client decide or come to a decision on a business issue. They need to make a business decision. And you need to decide what number crunching am I going to do to help them make that decision. They want to know, should we drop a product line? They don't tell you what number crunching to do. You're deciding what number crunching to do to help them make that decision. So perhaps you didn't get competent because you didn't do the right schedule. So in that situation, you have to understand, why didn't you do the right schedule? Were you just not technically up on that particular issue? Did you not give it enough thought? Were you in such a rush that you just put down anything without thinking about it? One of the ways to prevent yourself from doing a wrong schedule, I always tell my students this, is to always understand the purpose of the schedule before you do it. In other words, I always ask myself, what is the purpose of this schedule? And that way, hopefully, I'll come up with the right schedule. Because if I'm doing a schedule that's not going to help me make that decision, presumably that schedule has no purpose. So by asking myself, what is the purpose of the schedule I'm doing? Understanding the purpose, then I can say to myself, was this the right schedule to do? Does it accomplish the whole purpose? Sometimes people don't think about the purpose of the schedule and they just throw down any numbers. And that's the type of situation where you may end up doing useless numbers. But if you always make sure you understand the purpose of the numbers before you do them, hopefully you'll do numbers that serve the purpose of that particular requirement. Were there too few or too many quant items in my schedule? If you don't hit enough adjustments, you're not going to get competent. But if you hit too many adjustments, that's also not necessarily good. I realize it's very difficult to know how many adjustments to hit, but the one thing you know is you don't need to hit perfection. If it was a major schedule and you ended up hitting perfection, you probably wasted time. Now, if you're so brilliant that despite that, you were still able to do well on the other requirements, obviously that's nothing to worry about. But if you're like most people, where if they aim for perfection on the number crunching, they don't have enough time for the other requirements, then it is a problem. So you might want to, obviously you want to focus on whether you had too few adjustments, but you also want to pay attention. Did I go a lot further than I really needed to? Sometimes when people first start out at their case writing, it takes a while till they get their mind around the fact that they don't need to get perfection. You know, at work, you're always trying to do things perfectly. In university, you may have always been trying to do things perfectly. And therefore, it might be a mindset that takes time to develop. So if you went way overboard compared to what you needed to do on the guide, you might want to question, next time, maybe I'll aim for a lesser number of adjustments and leave more time for the other requirements. Now, if you've got too few adjustments, could be because you're just not working quickly enough. So within the time budget, you just weren't able to hit enough adjustments. That might just be a question of practice. You know, I found that when I did my first cash flow, it took me a long time to do a cash flow. So I couldn't get very many adjustments in within the time constraints. By the time I did my 8th cash flow, or whatever it was, my 5th cash flow, bottom line is I was much, much quicker. So it could be you just need more practice in that type of number crunching. Could also be a reading issue. You're missing a lot of adjustments. It could be that you're not keeping good track of the adjustments, right? What I always do for the numbers is I either have the number on my outline, or more often than not, I cross-reference to where the numbers are. Sometimes the numbers can be in more than one place. Could be that I had to do an MPV analysis. Some of the numbers were at the bottom of Appendix 3 and some were at the top of Appendix 5. So in my outline, I would write down MPV, bottom Appendix 3, and I'd also indicate Appendix 5. I'm reminding myself in my outline of where the numbers are. Could be the numbers were in two places and you only dealt with the numbers that were in one part of the case and ignored the numbers in another part of the case. They will sometimes purposely not put all the numbers in one place, in one appendix, forcing you to use numbers throughout the case. So very, very important to do a good job of tracking where the numbers are. One of the things that we talk about in our numerical methods course at PASS is tracking the numbers effectively so that when it comes time to write up the case, you don't miss numbers and you also don't waste time looking for numbers. Did I remember to address the PASS ancillary points? One of the things we also do in our numerical methods course is we talk about qualitative points that should accompany the number crunching that can often mean the difference between getting RC and competent. For example, I mentioned purpose earlier on. Not only do I think about the purpose, but I always put the purpose at the top of every exhibit. Assumptions. Where necessary, I show my assumptions. The bottom line is, notice my next point is, did I show assumptions where necessary? You don't always have to show assumptions. If it's a really simple calculation, I'm projecting out revenue based on 100 units times $10. I don't need to show that assumption. I'll just have the formula in my formula box, you know, in Excel, 100 times $10, and that's more than sufficient. Number one, I'm likely to get that number right. Once I get that number right, the marker's happy, whether I show my assumption or not. Even if I get it wrong, the market can see in my cell that I took 100 times 10. So if it's a really simple calculation, not critical to show your assumptions. But if it's a more complex calculation, very important to show your assumptions. So if it was a more complex calculation, I didn't show my assumptions, that might be something I want to be careful about the next time around. Did I remember to conclude on my appendix? Or my exhibit? I use the term appendix and exhibit interchangeably. We said earlier that when you're analyzing an accounting issue, for example, you want to come to a conclusion. I was discussing whether to capitalize development costs or expense them. I need to conclude one way or the other. We said the same thing when we were talking about audit reports. I offer two possibilities and then I recommend one. Number crunching also requires a conclusion. The conclusion when it comes to number crunching is just in plain, simple English. What do my numbers tell me? Every exhibit requires a conclusion. If you forget to conclude, that would be a reason to not get competent. Does your conclusion have to be correct compared with a perfect solution? No, as long as it's consistent with your numbers and you've done a good job. So the key isn't to have the right conclusion, but to have a conclusion consistent with your numbers. So I would ask myself, did I remember to conclude? If I didn't, I would make a strong mental note to do so in the future. Finally, were my quants easy to follow? If your quants are all over the place and they're completely disorganized, that could prevent the market from being able to follow them properly. So try to get good at keeping your quants in an orderly fashion that would be easy for a market to follow. If the market couldn't follow your quants, in all likelihood, they'll tell you that in the market comments, and you'll really want to take that to heart for the next time that you do a quant. The last thing I want to talk about is keeping tracking notes. Very, very important to have tracking notes for two reasons. Number one, it's a great idea to keep track of your performance, because at the end of the day, what I would do is I would have an Excel spreadsheet. And in my Excel spreadsheet, what I would do is the following. For every case, I would indicate how did I do in each of the AOs based on competency. So I basically have at the top of my, in the x-axis at the top, I would basically have, assurance, financial reporting, finance, etc. And then as I write each case, I would basically note the case. And then in each of the columns, I'd fill out, how did I do? Did I get RC? Did I get competent? Did I get nominal? And I have a separate column for each competency. By doing this and filling in this Excel spreadsheet every time you write a case, what you're accomplishing is the following. You can start at some point to see if there's a pattern. Perhaps I look at my assurance column, and my assurance column, I see that in my earlier cases, I was getting RC, and now I'm getting competent, so I'm very happy. But perhaps when I look at my column for financial reporting, where I'm keeping track of how I did in financial reporting on each case, I'm not improving enough. I keep getting RC. So now I know that's something I need to work on. Either I don't know my technical well enough and I've got to work on that, or I'm not doing a good enough job of applying my technical. But if you have a nice spreadsheet where you're keeping track of how you're doing on every case by competency, at least you can see what needs correction, what needs extra work. I also like to keep notes on my weaknesses. Presumably, when you're having things professionally marked, your marker will give you constructive criticism. So in a very nice, hopefully constructive way, they'll indicate your weaknesses. I would try to keep track of that and just try to see if over time these weaknesses are disappearing or not. Because till they disappear, I need to keep working on them. When it comes to technical notes, I would make summaries of the technical issues that came up, including what was tested. So what I mean by that is the following. As I'm writing cases, I keep track of the technical issues that were tested, but I also keep track of what aspect was tested. So I wouldn't just keep a note that revenue rec was tested, but I'd keep notes of what aspects of revenue rec was tested. And the reason that this is helpful is you'll start to see that certain aspects of a particular topic tend to come up a lot. And then you know, okay, this aspect of that technical topic, I really need to know well. Because what I find is for the larger technical topics, very often there are certain aspects of that topic that come up all the time and other aspects of that topic that simply do not come up very frequently. So it is very important to keep track of that. This completes our discussion of the 6 steps for doing an effective debriefing. I hope you found this very helpful. PASS offers various courses for the CFE, as well as resources which you can purchase, including material as well as videos. To learn more about the PASS courses and resources, as well as to register for PASS courses or purchase PASS resources, please feel free to visit the PASS website, passyourcpas.ca, and there's a great deal of information on the various courses and resources available at PASS. Admission to courses is on a first-come, first-served basis, so registering sooner rather than later is always a good idea to ensure admission. In case you have any questions, I'd be delighted to speak with you or to communicate with you by email. I've given you my contact information. The contact information for Michael Levy, mjlevy at passyourcpa.ca is my email. I've also given you my phone number, which is also my WhatsApp number. Also, feel free to call or correspond in any way with my partner, Ira Wallfish. For Ira, you've got his email as well as his phone number. We hope you found this session helpful, and we look forward to seeing you in one of our courses. Have a great day, everyone.